Well, hello and welcome to A World Awakening. My name is Rupert and I'm very happy to have with me today Jeff Turner. Hi, Jeff. How are you today?
Rupert, I'm great, my friend. How are you?
I'm not too bad. I have had COVID, but I have got over it pretty quickly. I've been meditating and trying to heal myself, and one or two friendly beings coming in to assist me. And today I actually feel I've got my energy back. I feel fairly alive. So
Good. Well, I'm sorry to hear that you had it, but I'm glad to hear you're doing better. And it's an honor to be here tonight with you, my friend.
yeah, it's wonderful to be here. Andrea is off away at a convention. I'm not even sure what convention it is. Do you happen to know?
I don't. I know she's in Michigan. I know she's here in the same state as me, I believe. But I don't know what the actual convention is. So,
Well, I know she arrived safely. She
Mhm.
was texting me before and after the flight, so she's got to wherever she needs to get to safely.
Mm.
And I'm happy to stand in for her. And she told me I can do anything I want to do. And I thought, well, I haven't really had just a one-to-one conversation with you yet, and I like the idea of doing so.
Yes.
So I would like today to find out a little bit more about you first, and then maybe talk a little bit about religion.
Okay.
And I'm coming at this from a perspective of somebody who is not religious. I started off religious, I moved away from it, but I'm very respectful of religions and religious people because I feel that they have got, if I could sort of call religions they have got a lot of aspects of reality that are not recognized generally in our everyday lives. They've got a lot of those aspects of reality correct. And so rather than focus on the things that maybe religions may not have got right, in my opinion, today I thought we could focus a little bit on what religions have got right. But let's start with you.
Yeah.
Who are you, Jeff? And how do you come to be here?
Okay. Well, apparently from my appearance in the camera here, I'm a very tired individual because my eyes look bloodshot here. Oh my goodness.
You know,
Anyway,
they've got like a touch up function
yeah.
in StreamYard here. I was playing with it earlier on and I just looked silly. So you,
I've done the same thing once or twice when I've been on, and I was like, oh man, I tried it, and I was like, no, I think I'll go natural. But yeah, I think it's just from staring at the screen and these lights here for the last hour on the last show. I think my eyes are just bloodshot. Anyways, my name is Jeff Turner. I am a former pastor. I was a pastor for 12 years. I'm still an ordained minister. However, I function very differently now than I once did. A lot of you know that I host the Soul School Sojourn with Andrea, which is the show that's on for the hour just before World Awakening. And we've been doing that now for about 2 years. I believe it's 2 years this May. I could be off in that timing, but it's something like that. And so some of you may know me, some of you might not. But my story is maybe boring to some, but I grew up in a fairly conservative religious home, Christian home, and not of the oppressive variety, but conservative Christian nonetheless. And I became a pastor myself. I became a very, very radical at a very young age. At about, let's say, 15 or 16, I got really, let's say, set on fire by the particular Christian message that I was being exposed to. And, I took on a very radical lifestyle. Beginning at about 17, and I kid you not, I'm not saying this just to like make my testimony sound crazy, but I was praying 8, 9, 10 hours a day in concert. I hardly slept. I wore grooves in the carpet in my parents' basement, pacing back and forth, just praying like a madman. My vision of God was God was this very distant being whom you very much wanted to be on your side and whose side you very much wanted to be on. And there were these things and there were these practices you could do to attain that. They included a sort of ascetic lifestyle, holiness, a lot of sort of moral restrictions and things like that. I was very strict in how I conducted myself. I still am pretty strict in how I conduct myself, but for different reasons. I think I'm just sort of a disciplined person. But at the time, I was doing it with the aim of pleasing and appeasing this God who dwelt just beyond yonder cumulonimbus cloud formation, and I was always trying to earn this God's favor. And it was through fervent prayer, again, abstaining from certain things. I fasted every other day of my life for a season. And I did this well into my 20s. And I was very radical. I took this thing very seriously. Never once, even to this day, have I taken it really anything less than serious. I just know it well enough now to not take it seriously. And that's how I take it seriously. I think G.K. Chesterton is the one who said that the test of a good religion is whether you can laugh at it or not. And so I think the more seriously you take it, the less seriously you take it. But I really did that for a long while, and I became a pastor at a very young age. I became a full-time pastor. Full-time, it was my full-time career. It wasn't something I did on the side. I did that for 12 years, beginning at 21 years of age. I was married. I got married at 19, and we went right into pastoral ministry after I graduated from Bible school, continued some of my education just through correspondence as we pastored. And, it was great until it wasn't. And it didn't become not great because it became not great because it became untenable. Like I said, I take this very seriously. And part of taking it seriously is taking it to its logical end, right?
Right, yeah.
And I tried to. And I think the way that my brain works, I get very obsessive about things. If I'm onto something, I'm on it. I latch onto it like a pit bull, and I'm not going to let go. That's just how my brain is. And I'm going to test the limits of this thing, and I'm going to push it, and I'm going to go for it. And that's how I was with the form of Christianity that I was involved in. And I came to what I at least perceived to be the end of it, where it no longer worked the way that I thought it should work, right? And that came about as a result of certain things happening to me that just weren't supposed to happen to someone like me. You know what I mean? Someone who thought of themselves the way that I thought of myself. There's just certain things that aren't supposed to happen, certain events that aren't supposed to take place in the life of someone like yourself.
Yeah.
But I found myself smack dab in the middle of a lot of contradictions. In the Hegelian dialectic, you have thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. My thesis going in was one thing, and I experienced the antithesis, the antithetical way, and it just about undid me. And so I'm condensing a lot of this into just a few paragraphs here, or many quickly spoken paragraphs. But I found myself right in the middle of what we would call a crisis of faith. I really lost my faith for a season, and I was still pastoring, but I became, for all suits and purposes, an atheist, and I'll never forget buying Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion from our local Barnes & Noble and sandwiching it between a copy of The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis and some other banal Christian title that I found. I kind of sandwiched it between there like I was a teenager trying to buy a Playboy or something. I mean, that's kind of how I perceived it. It was like this deep shame, but it was before Kindle and Audible where I could have just gotten it that way. Or I was so sheltered. I didn't know of such things. No, but I remember buying that and just again, like a teenager, at night under my blankets, reading it and having my world rocked by it. And this was probably, I don't even know, 14, 15, maybe a little less than that, but not that long ago. But at the same time, much further back there than it seems. And it really rocked my world. And, from there I began to explore, more sophisticated, I think, forms of or atheist arguments. I really immersed myself in that world for a season, and my faith fell apart on me. It really did. And I was still pastoring, and some will say, well, that's rather hypocritical to continue pastoring while having no belief, and you would be right. But it's kind of easier said than done to just leave because it was my career. It's what I was educated to do. It was the career path I was on. It was how I paid my mortgage. It was how I took care of my kids. And I don't say that to say I was doing it for the money at that point. I really did care about what I did. It was deeply personal and very important to me. but I came to a point where I just couldn't believe certain things anymore. I wanted to, because I wanted to be normal. I wanted to be able to do what I thought I was supposed to do, but I just couldn't do it. I'm honest with myself sometimes to a fault, and that can be both a good and a bad thing. But I just couldn't keep on doing it anymore. And it was very difficult. It was a very difficult season of life. But in that season of life, I found my former fundamentalist way of being, not just the religion itself, but the way of being that I had adopted as a result of being ensconced in that belief system. I found it all just melting. It all just fell apart on me, and I guess that was the antithesis. I went in with a thesis, I experienced the antithesis, and everything just dissolved. I lost it. And I really didn't know how to function anymore. It was just very, very difficult. And so eventually I left just because I had rediscovered something like faith prior to leaving. But even so, it was so transformed that I just couldn't honestly say that it was what people thought it was. Do you know if that makes any sense?
Yeah.
I just couldn't present myself as being what people thought I was, even though I came to a point where I could use the same language again without being triggered by it. But I knew I meant something so different that I just couldn't operate in that way, because I knew people would perceive me as saying something that I wasn't saying. And so for that and a few other reasons, I had to leave. And over the last, almost decade now, I've worked very hard on rediscovering what it was about faith that was so important to me, to begin with. Because I think what happens is, well, okay. So if you're familiar with the work of Nietzsche at all, in his book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is my favorite of Nietzsche's works, it's in the prologue to that, where he talks about the three metamorphoses of the human spirit. And he talks about three kind of transformations, three stages of transformation that the soul undergoes in life. And I think it could also be viewed in a collective way. He talks about us beginning as camels. That is, we are burden bearers, and we think the heavier the burden we bear, the more noble a creature we are. And so we bend our backs in dromedarian fashion and we say, load us up, and we bear whatever burden's thrown on us, whether it's our parents' political ideologies, the religious belief system, whatever. And we bear that burden and we think we chose it, right? We think it's ours because it's all we've ever known. Then we go into the wilderness, Nietzsche says, and we realize that the one who's burdened us thusly is the dragon called Thou Shalt. And on every scale of this dragon is written another Thou Shalt, some kind of religious command going back millennia, he says. And it's there where we realize we've been, bamboozled, and we didn't choose these things. We were being played. And so he says that's where the camel becomes the lion. And the lion roars its sacred no in the face of the dragon, Thou Shalt. And so that was kind of my experience when I kind of lost faith. It was that season of heavy, heavy deconstruction and shedding things and letting things go. Some of the first things to go was like the doctrine of original sin, the idea that because some primordial produce plucking parent, did something a talking snake told him to do, I'm born under the wrath of God. It just didn't make sense, and not only did it not make sense, like in reality, even scripturally, I couldn't make sense of it. So that one fell. And then when that fell, the doctrine of eternal conscious torment and hell fell, because I'm like, well, if we're not born under the wrath of God, why would God create a hell? Anyways, all these pillars just began to fall one by one by one. And that was kind of that season of the lion for me, of roaring that sacred no in the face of these different things. And they all began to fall one by one. And I think the problem is a lot of times we get stuck there. We get stuck in the lion phase of just kind of living in protest to what was. But Nietzsche says the final stage, and it's a metaphor, so I don't think it's ever final, but in this metaphor anyways, the final stage of metamorphosis is that of the child, which seems, it's not logical because you think you'd start as a child, but he says you grow up into the child. And that's where you you develop or you learn how to say your sacred yes as opposed to your sacred no. And he says you become a wheel that's propelled from its own center. You become a creator here instead of one who is placed in a creation. And and it's sort of this, pardon me, it's sort of the synthesis of the camel and the lion in some way. But you don't put a camel and a lion together and get a chimeric hybrid of a camel and lion. You put opposing forces together, and in alchemical terms, you get an explosive reaction. You get something completely different from what you're putting into it. When synthesis happens, you don't just get a hybrid of the two things that come together. You get this transformation. You get something completely different. And so that's kind of what I began to experience. Is I was experiencing faith again, but it was nothing like what I thought faith was. Because to me, previously, faith was just feigning certainty in every circumstance. Whenever I was faced with contradictions, I would just be like, well, the Bible says this and I believe it, and that settles it. Bless God. Hallelujah. And that's how it was. And then I came to a place where everything was just doubt, and it was just question everything, tear everything to pieces, don't believe anything. And that's fine too. But, Kierkegaard also interestingly has a 3-phase transformation where you begin with the aesthetic, then you go to the ethical, and then you come to the religious again, which is where you kind of take a leap of faith, where it's like, well, I've experienced certainty that was unearned. I just believed what I was told to believe. And then I've experienced doubt, which was earned. And now I'm at a point where I'm ready to just kind of make let's say an informed assumption that I know very well could be wrong, just to see. But at this point, I know it's not really going to hurt me if it's wrong, because I know I've been wrong about the thing that I thought was most important, right? And I think we're all doing this anyways, in one form or another. I mean, whether we're a hardcore materialist or a hardcore religionist, we are all at that beginning point making a leap of faith in some way. Terence McKenna used to say the hard materialist, says, give me one free miracle and I can explain the rest to you. Well, the religious person basically does the same thing. So we're all doing that in one form or fashion. And so I came back to that point where it was like, and interestingly enough, a lot of it had to do with revisiting paranormal events from my childhood, things that I couldn't explain, because for 13 years we lived in a house that for all suits and purposes was haunted, But at the time, because of my upbringing, the only way to properly speak of those things was to call them demons, right? Because that was the only language we had.
Right. Yeah.
And those experiences sort of passed through the membrane of our philosophy, and that's kind of how they appeared to us. But then in retrospect, I could realize maybe they were something altogether different. But what stuck with me was the fact that I encountered the numanness. I encountered something that I couldn't really, I couldn't explain it. And I went through all the debunkers, and that was a part of my atheist phase, you listen to the James Randys and the Darren Browns, and then the more sophisticated debunkers who kind of show you how all of this is bunk and it's all stupid and it's all garbage. And the, who's the guy, the super skeptic guy? I can't remember, but I passed through all of that and thought I had explained it all. But then at night when I was in my bed and I was being honest because I was tired and wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone, I would remember things that I had no explanation for. And all of the explanations I was given seemed to fall short. Maybe they didn't, but they seemed to fall short. And so there was this sort of wonder that began to arise in me again. And I began to just consider maybe, the philosopher Richard Kearney talks about atheism, and then he talks about anatheism. And anatheism is returning to God after God, where God represents something more like possibility, right, than a single being that you can call by this name who has a beard, right? And so I kind of began to return to that, to God as that possibility. And so I've kind of been riding that horse for the last decade, and it's taken me down some strange paths, but I'm enjoying the ride. And in some ways I feel like I'm tied to it. I feel like I'm less riding it and more tied to it. I just kind of feel like I can't get away from it. So,
wow. Fascinating.
That was a mouthful, I know. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to ask some specific questions, if you don't mind, just to
Please.
sort of delve into that some more.
Absolutely.
You right now, would you say that you in whatever definition we use of the word God, do you believe in God?
I do, but what? Again, I would say that God to me is the name of a possibility. And I know that sounds like I'm just obfuscating and trying to dodge the question. I do, believe me, I understand that because I've gone through it myself. We're like, are you just trying to get out of saying whether you believe it or not? Are you really just an atheist still? And not that that would be a bad thing if I was. I'm not saying that. But I do. I do. I do believe in God. What exactly that is, though, I couldn't tell you. It is the ineffable. It is something that I do my best to wrap words around, but fall appallingly short,
Yeah.
every time I try. And I guess that's kind of the nature of God. It's unspeakable. And I think I kind of understand God. If Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, wrote the Theologica Mystica, which is a book, an old book, which was it's basically where we get the idea of, excuse me, where we get the idea of apophatic theology. And apophatic theology means theology. It means negative theology. It's theology by negation. It's kind of like coming to know something by unknowing things. In the same way that you might chisel a statue by removing chunks of marble or whatever, apophatic theology kind of approaches it similarly. Like, okay, well, God isn't this and it's not this, and then eventually something kind of begins to take shape. He also had a book after that, I think called I can't remember the title of it, but where he does cataphatic theology then, which is positive theology, but still the whole apophatic tradition really appeals to me, because you kind of understand the divine by negation. And but then there is that point, though, Derrida, if you're familiar with Jacques Derrida at all, in the kind of philosophy of deconstructionism, even Derrida talks about hitting up against the non-deconstructible. And the non-deconstructible is something like hospitality. And hospitality in his thinking was something like leaving. He uses the illustration of the Jewish tradition of leaving open a seat at the table for the prophet Elijah symbolically. He kind of uses that as a philosophical way of saying, leaving open this space of possibility in your life for whatever God is to manifest God's self. So I kind of started down that path. That's kind of how I started, just leaving a seat at the table of possibility, right? And just being like, maybe, because I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I call myself an atheistic theist. Like, I believe and I don't believe, and I don't believe and I believe, and that was the title of my last book, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, available on Amazon. The subtitle being Why There Is No God and You Should Follow Him. Yep.
I find that, people ask me the question, do you believe in God?
Yeah.
And the trouble is that the word God means so many different things to so many different people.
Yeah.
That is almost a meaningless question, because you've got to define better what you mean by God before you can answer that question.
Yeah.
And so for those people that don't know, I'm a space scientist.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trained in logical thinking, and I break down everything into little manageable bite-sized chunks that I can get a proper answer to. Mm-hmm. And so I can break down the question, do you believe in God, into numerous smaller questions like, do you believe that there is a conscious entity out there who created the universe?
Yeah.
Do you believe that God is an entirely moral, an all moral being who is supremely good?
Yeah, right.
Do you believe that God created humans? Do you believe that God created the earth? Whatever people, whatever actions or characteristics people often ascribe to God, let's put them into small bite-sized chunks. Mm-hmm. And then, for example, with the question, did God create humans? Then I can use my knowledge of science and my logical my skills of logical processing to really look at that question and answer it in a way where I can really determine an answer that I think that I can know. Because we know, I say we, if you go away and learn this stuff, and if you look at the evidence, you can logically prove that this process referred to as evolution is not just real, it can't not be real. When you understand, that offspring are produced with variation, and some of those variations are more conducive to survival than others, and therefore the genes that lead to those survival advantages naturally continue and pass on, and a species evolves in a direction that helps it. And there's so many lines of it can't not be true that we can absolutely 100% determine. And I'm sure that many people are going to disagree with me. And if you do disagree with me, anybody listening, I still want to be friends with you. I still want to be peaceful with you. I don't hate you, and I hope we can still be friends. But evolution is real, and therefore you can reach a conclusion that God did not create humans in the way that it is described in religion.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, you might be able to go back in, and say, well, is there a possibility that God somehow put some kind of spark into the earth at the beginning, and maybe then there's room for God somewhere else. But this is the process that I use to try and answer some of those big questions.
Yeah. No, and I agree with you 100%. And I think literal interpretation of religion is always going to be the worst interpretation of religion, right? Because we're talking about things that are impossible to talk about. When you're attempting to talk about religion, theology, as much as I enjoy it, is fan fiction. Right? It's fan fiction. It's about as sophisticated as 50 Shades of Grey, which is Twilight fan fiction. You know what I mean? That's not to say it's not sophisticated in its own right. I'm just saying we are doing our best, fingers pointing at the moon and all of that, right? And then fingers pointing at the moon, back ad infinitum. But literal interpretations of religion are the worst interpretations of religion, because, for one, the people who gave us these religions weren't literal thinkers. We're talking about pre-scientific people, right? And so they're not scientific thinkers. They're not thinking they're not thinking post-enlightenment. They're not thinking rationality. I need evidence. They don't know the scientific method. They're symbolic thinkers, right? And so they think in terms of symbols. Now, I don't even know if they're thinking, this is a weird way of saying it, but I don't know if they're literally thinking in terms of symbols, except for that just might be the way that the mind and language worked. So they might not be, let's say, telling the Genesis story of creation, but thinking to themselves, well, what we really mean is this. It may very well just kind of be erupting from the unconscious somehow, in a way that they're telling the collective human story. And by the collective human story, I don't necessarily mean the story of human origins, but the story of the human being, right? What we all go through in our life, the sort of archetypal journey that we all journey, they're telling it through this creation motif. And it's also asinine to take it literally, because, for example, we know the genesis of the book of Genesis, right? It's borrowed from the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation epic. It's codified and written down when the Israelites are enslaved in Babylon, so they're exposed to this literature. It mirrors many other Mesopotamian creation epics, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Epic of Atrahasis. So clearly this was not just written down because God told some guy this is exactly how it happened. And they're writing down the story the way they write it down, and it's also not because they're like looking off of someone else's paper and copying. I think that's also a pretty like unsophisticated way of understanding religion, where we say, they just copied off of other religions. It's like, well,
Yeah.
yeah, duh, genius. We all just copy, that's kind of how knowledge works. We're all kind of copying and then expanding, I mean, there really aren't too many original thoughts. We're working with what we copy and what we borrow from someone else. And I don't mean to be a smart aleck about it, but I just mean, sometimes I hear these arguments and I'm like, man, have you thought more than 5 seconds about this?
Yeah.
But there tends to be this sort of venom when it comes to Judeo-Christian religion that I don't sense with other religions sometimes. And I also understand it completely, believe me, because I've been there and done that and have a little bit of nagging cynicism left to prove it. But anyways, going back to what I was saying about them being symbolic thinkers, they are thinking in terms of symbols, and the symbolic and what the symbolic symbolizes, those things obviously emerge mutually. The same way that if you're doing a needlepoint or like a needlepoint, like cross stitch kind of thing, you have the part that's very clear. You know what it is. It's a little cabin. There's a little smoke coming out of the chimney. There's a little sun in the corner. But then you turn it around and it's kind of this mess of threads, right? And if you look only at the mess of threads, you might not know what you're looking at. But then if you look at the front, it's sort of the legend at the bottom of the map that unlocks what different colors and squiggly lines mean on the map. And then you turn it around and you're like, oh, I see it. This is just kind of a different way of telling the same thing, but you can't have one without the other. So the symbolic and the meaning of the symbolic, they work similarly, but that doesn't mean anyone's trying to be symbolic. It just means in doing one, you're doing the other. So ancient peoples are more symbolic thinkers. So they're not following God around in the Garden of Eden being like, okay, and then he formed a man out of dust. All right. And then he exhaled into his nostrils. Okay. He twitched 3 times, blinked his eyes, and came to life. I mean, that's not the way they're doing it, right? They're telling a story about consciousness. They're telling a story about, as a human being, when we become conscious of reality. It's telling the story of lost innocence, that the partaking of the knowledge of good and evil and being removed from the garden is sort of that experience in life of whether we experience the traumatic or the transcendent, and we find ourselves now outside of the comfortable environment we grew up in, and we have to kind of find our way back in some way. It's sort of that hero's journey motif. The hero with 1,000 faces. Adam and Eve are one face that hero wears, So to me, that's what these stories are trying to tell us. Nobody is trying to tell us, I don't think, literal origins, because I don't necessarily think they would have been as interested in that as we are. Now, it's valid for us to be interested in it, and that's not to say they weren't. But we have to just bear in mind that these aren't scientific thinkers. These are pre-scientific minds that think of symbolism and meaning. They're trying to make sense of life, not necessarily asking, what's the literal genesis of humanity, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, Jeff. Do you think that if you, as you are today, had the ability to time travel back to you at the age of 19 or 20 when you were very faithful, if you would say to yourself back then that this stuff is not literal, that it's supposed to be taken symbolically, how do you think that conversation would go?
I know exactly how it would have gone. It would have gone, this version of myself would have walked away very frustrated. And a 19-year-old, 20-year-old me would have had a double-barrel shotgun full of apologetic answers and responses to all of my objections, some of which would just be, well, the Bible says, some of them may have been a little bit more teased out and sophisticated, but when I came to the end of my ability to answer a question, I would have just reverted to something like that. Or, well, we can't understand everything right now, but one day we will. But that's just because I only had one framework in which to work, right? Yeah. All I had was evangelical Christianity, and everything good I knew about life took place within that frame. The amazing family I grew up in, and I did grow up in an amazing family. My mom and dad, saints, absolute saints. I don't have a bit of I don't know. Maybe if somebody put me in like deep regression or something, they could pull something out. But I don't have any trauma from my parents. I have nothing that I could bring up. You know, maybe I dropped a screwdriver while helping my dad, and he said, you know, we all have something like that. But I mean, my parents are just, they're the closest thing in physical form to what I imagine God to be that I can imagine. I mean, they are that. But everything I knew about life that was good, and I had a very good childhood, it all took place in this context. You know, the meaning that I found in my own life came from this. I derived it all from this. So, but it all hinged on this being true, literally, because that was all I had to work with. No one ever told me, look, man, all of these principles, all of these values, you can still derive them from this, but you don't have to literally believe that two animals of every species somehow found their way to a giant boat made out of gopher wood. And you don't have to believe that literally happened that way to take away from it what you've seen others take away from it. No, I didn't know that. All I knew was literalism. It was the only way. So that's why I would have defended it the way I defended it. And I think that's why so many people defend it the way they defend it, because tied to it is all of this other stuff. And they think that if they lose the literal truth of it, they lose all of this other stuff with it. So like, let's say, we know that, for example, addictions, like a religious kind of conversion experience, William James and the Variety of Religious Experiences talks about this, that the equivalent of a conversion experience is one of the better ways for people to overcome addiction, right? It just is. It seems to work like magic, and it's probably all going on up here. Doesn't matter, right? 50% of what you get from an SSRI is placebo, right? And that doesn't mean there's not real chemical things happening, because there certainly is. But a good portion of what you're getting is also placebo. That's just mainstream, neuroscience. So a religious conversion experience, people can get, my own dad, I mean, he had a very rough early life. And in an instant, in the cab of his truck as a truck driver, he experienced something that turned his entire life upside down. But his life was so upside down, it was actually turned right side up. And he was instantly, alcoholism, drug abuse, all sorts of things, just never touched it again, and it happened through a religious conversion experience. Well, then the first thing he's introduced to that sort of matches the experience he had is a kind of more intense evangelical Christianity. So of course, then that experience becomes connected to all of the beliefs of this system, right? And so I use this illustration a lot. It's kind of like we begin as liquid, and then we settle into molds, right? And then we harden into those molds, and then either the traumatic or the transcendent touches our lives, and we melt again, and then we're poured into other molds, and then we harden into those molds. We're going to take the shape of whatever mold we're poured into, and we liquefy to the point where we can be poured into a new mold through the transcendent or the traumatic. And so you have a religious conversion, and all of this stuff comes with it. Let's say you were an alcoholic, and now you're just like, I don't want to touch the stuff. Like, that stuff happens, right? But then the mold that you get poured into is one of intense fundamentalist evangelicalism or something else. I'm just speaking from my own background. It can be any number of things. Well, then you take on that form, and you think you have to defend that form, or you'll lose everything you gained in the experience. But that's just a devotion to form, right? There's another form that a liquid can take, which is a vapor, which is not a slave to any mold, right? And it can hover over one and even condense into one for a season, but then it can leave. It can take from it what it needs, and then it can leave, and it can sort of be this migratory thing. But we attach our experiences to belief systems, and so we think to lose the system is to lose the experience, right? And that's why we defend it as doggedly as we do, because we're taught that faith is certainty. And faith, I think faith is really more jumping into a mystery than it is pretending to have certainty.
Yeah. I'm going to pause for a second,
Yeah.
Jeff. Thank you. And I'm looking through the comments of people, and I'd just like to say hello to a few people who are out there. Nikki Colbridge, hello, thank you for being here. Mr. Mello, thank you also for being here. Lynn Bowling, hello to Toledo, to the Midwest Parafest, and congratulations to Chad and Heather, who just got married.
Nice.
Laura, hey, it's good to have you with us. Thank you for being here. Trish, Joe, Helen, Laura, Marie, thank you everybody for being here. I appreciate you showing up and showing your support, even though Andrea is not here. Now, Jeff, one of the things that I wanted to really look at today was the fact that whether we're talking about religions, like large-scale religions, or smaller belief systems throughout the millennia, many of those belief systems have introduced a coherent way of accepting into our everyday lives paranormal phenomena. Mm-hmm. Things that that in our everyday lives are not generally accepted, but to their credit, religions and many other belief systems, they do recognize that there is an afterlife. Mm-hmm. They do recognize that there are conscious entities other than just living humans. Mm-hmm. They recognize that there are psychic things going on, healing going on. So, I'm in a similar place to you in that I don't accept all of the literal interpretations of those phenomenon, but the fact that they have recognized the phenomenon as being real is something I think that deserves credit and celebration.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that I think religion can be, well, the word religion in Latin is religare, which means to bind together. And I've heard that used sort of in the pejorative as meaning like, see, religion binds you to archaic superstitions and Bronze Age belief systems. And it certainly can manifest that way. But another way of thinking about that is that religion is what kind of binds the elements of your life together, right? It binds communities together. It can bind nations together. It has sometimes for good or for bad, but that's kind of the effect that it has. And so that's one of the ways, so for example, my own story, I grew up in a home, as I said, that was paranormally charged, shared experiences by 3, 4, 5 people, one person, it could be a delusion. 2 people, you could be sharing a delusion. 4 or 5, it's getting less likely. The family that moves into the house after you, having the exact same experiences without knowing what happened prior to, okay, well then we're a little bit more unlikely, and but I grew up having experiences like that. And then I went through a season where I jettisoned all supernatural belief, or I tried to, and I, again, did all the debunking stuff, went through all of that. Michael Shermer, all these guys, I just immersed myself in all of that kind of skeptical literature. And I figured out, what was really behind it all, what was really going on. It's the idiometer effect. It's this, it's that, it's the other, it's pareidolia. I had answers for everything. But I really had answers for nothing when I was quiet at the end of the night, like I said, and really thought back. And I was like, no, that doesn't really do anything to, that really doesn't answer that question. But holding that space open, like I said, which is what God became for me in a sense, was that I call it an altar of possibility. In the book of Acts, chapter 17, the Apostle Paul is said to have gone into the city of Athens, and he was trying to find a way to communicate to them this new message he was preaching about this man named Jesus the Christ. And so his method was he found an altar, because the streets were lined with different gods and deities, but he found an altar that said, "To an unknown God," which was a way, and there's a history to that, but it basically was a way of saying, hey, just in case anybody else shows up, we just want to be hospitable. And so he said, okay, I've seen this altar to an unknown God, and I'm just here to tell you who it is, right? So I call it an altar of suspicion that we kind of have to keep open in our life, an altar of possibility, where I suspect that there's more to the world than it appears to me at present that there is. And you keep that altar open, right? And you keep that place there. It's just like you can be wrong about anything, kind of thing. And but God kind of became that for me when I lost my certainty about my certainty that there was no God, and I opened that altar of possibility back up. Well, one of the first things that rushed in to fill that vacuum was these experiences from childhood, where I began to be like, okay, see, there's no way that was just pareidolia. There's no way that that was just this, that, or the other. There's something more going on there. And yeah, it allowed me to believe for those things. And yeah, I won't rattle on and on about that because I think you probably have something more to say about it. So
Yeah, it's very interesting what you said is earlier on, that some of those experiences, I think you implied that you may have interpreted some of those experiences perhaps as being demonic.
mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that is something that I see. I think, I am an alien contact specialist. That's
Mm-hmm.
how I describe myself. I communicate and host events where we communicate with alien entities.
Mm-hmm.
And some people call them aliens, some people call them extraterrestrials. And there are some beings that appear to us as humanoid beings of light, Pleiadians, for example. Now, when these Pleiadians come in, I am certain that I know for sure that some people see them and say, those are angels.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that some people who see more grey-like looking beings, Zeta Reticuli, they see them and say, well, those are demons.
Mm-hmm.
And these beings are not new to the earth. They haven't only just started coming here. They've been with us for at least several thousand years, probably going back millions of years in some cases. And I think it's highly likely that throughout, when you look at religions, when you look in the Bible, for example, when the people back then encountered Pleiadians, encountered grey-like beings, then they took the evidence, and then their interpretation of what that evidence was done through the lens of their vocabulary, their culture, their religious beliefs, and they became angels and demons.
Yeah, no, I think that's more than possible. I mean, to say anything definitively about it, I mean, I obviously can't, but no, I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. Whether you're encountering, whether it's encountering something from inner space, some projection of the unconscious, or something literally coming in from another dimension or another galaxy or universe, I mean, it has to pass through. It has to pass through the membrane of your individual consciousness before your brain can register the experience. And there's multiple layers there it has to go through, right? So even a comment, let's say from a loved one, passes through those layers. So if you're a person who is always suspicious of another person's intentions, and somebody says something very sweet and very kind and loving to you, it passes through your suspicions, and you're like, oh, they're trying to manipulate me. They're trying to get something from me. And you might be completely wrong about that. And then if you're a super trusting person, someone might say something manipulative to you, and you might say, oh, they love me so much, right? It's because those things have to pass through these filters. And experiences with conscious entities would be no different. They're going to pass through our biases. They're going to pass through our belief system, our mythology, and they're going to take the form even of the sort of, let's say, playable characters. If you imagine it as like a video game that you've unlocked, you've got this, choose your fighter, and you've got all these different guys, you've got a collection of them in your mind those are the entities that populate the cosmos or whatever, your pantheon. If you have an experience with something, your brain's going to fit it into one of those slots and say, oh, that's what it was. It was an angel. It was a demon. And the more binary you get, the more limited you are in what it is you can experience. And so for me, it was just angels and demons, right? Well, God and Satan, angels and demons, and those kind of work the same way. But even in Judaism and early Christianity, even in those, religions that we often think are very limited in their understanding of the supernatural, you go back to Second Temple Jewish literature, they see the universe as inhabited by all sorts of exotic flora and fauna. It's not just angels and demons. And demons are, there's all sorts of crazy. There's like the spirit of the dead Nephilim that they call the Rephaim. There's the Watchers that you see recorded in the book of First Enoch. You do have angels, and these angels have names and they have rankings. You've got all sorts of things, that are not just black and white, cut and dry, good guys and bad guys. So even there, we've just gotten, the further along we go, we simplify and we reduce. And then our experiences are filtered through those reductions, and the world is just black and white. And and then it manifests itself as us calling this good and that bad. And it manifests itself right down into everyday life, where we do it to each other as well.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's possible to come away with a final message before we finish. We've got about a minute and a half before we finish here. But I would like to encourage people to see that you, that me, that we all, through humanity, through thousands of years, we observe things and we interpret in different ways. And we often change how we interpret these things over time, within our own lifetimes, and certainly over thousands of years. And if we are to be wise, we should not just accept as truth without proof that right here today we are making the right interpretation. We're making the correct interpretation. If we can entertain the possibility that what we hold as being true might not be, then that opens ourselves up to gaining higher level knowledge, and also reducing a lot of conflict around the planet.
Yeah.
That would be my final message. We've got about 20 seconds before we should finish. Jeff, do you want to have any final words?
Yeah, no, I would agree with everything you just said. And I would say the Socratic dictum of the only thing that I'm certain about is that I'm probably wrong about everything. It's a great way of approaching life. It really is, because you're always open to change. You're always open to being transformed. And it's a good way to live. And, don't be devoted to your own projections. Open yourself up to projectiles that challenge your projections. And if God is anything, it's a projection, or it's a projectile crashing into our projections, calling us to change.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And thank you, everybody who is out there for listening. You all take care. Have a good night.